He thought his money made him invincible. When a rich bully humiliates a waitress, only one man stands up, a quiet stranger with a German shepherd. But instead of justice, the corrupt police arrive and cuff the hero, laughing as they cage his dog. They made a fatal mistake. They had no idea they'd just arrested a Navy SEAL and his K-9 partner. The thick summer heat of rural Ohio shimmered above the asphalt, clinging to the endless fields of corn that lined the county highway like a silent, green ocean. It was a place that moved to its own rhythm, a slow, steady pulse that was supposed to bring peace to a weary soul. But for Jack Callahan, relaxation was a foreign concept he was still struggling to grasp. Jack steered his old, sun-faded Dodge Ram down the road toward town, the suspension groaning in protest against the uneven pavement. He was a man who took up space even when sitting still, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his plain gray t-shirt and a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite. His eyes, a piercing blue, were in constant motion, checking mirrors and blind spots with a practiced intensity that was a byproduct of his profession as a Navy SEAL. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Kaiser, a massive German shepherd with a coat of midnight black and rich tan. Kaiser was not a pet. He was a weapon wrapped in fur, a military working dog who had seen more combat than most veteran soldiers. The dog sat with perfect posture, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, catching every sound of the waking countryside, while his amber eyes watched the world pass with a stoic intelligence. They were on leave, a mandatory decompression period ordered by his commanding officer after a particularly grueling rescue mission in the Horn of Africa. But the off switch was proving impossible to find. Jack pulled the truck into the gravel lot of a small, squat diner called the Crossroads. The building looked like it had weathered 100 thunderstorms, with peeling white paint and a humming neon sign that flickered with a comfortable inconsistency. It was the kind of place that promised strong coffee and no questions, which was exactly what Jack needed. He killed the engine and looked at Kaiser. "Stay close, buddy," Jack said softly, his voice raspy from disuse. The dog let out a low, affirmative huff and waited for a hand signal before gracefully leaping from the truck. Together, they walked to the entrance, moving with a synchronized gait that spoke of years of partnership. A bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, announcing their arrival to a room that smelled of fried bacon, old coffee, and lemon polish. The diner was mostly empty, save for a few old-timers nursing their mugs and murmuring about the humidity and the price of feed. Jack chose a booth in the back corner, a tactical position that offered a clear view of the entrance and the entire room. He slid onto the cracked vinyl seat, and Kaiser immediately curled up under the table, positioning himself out of the way but ready for action. A moment later, a waitress approached their table. She looked young, maybe early 20s, with strands of brown hair escaping her messy bun and dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Her name tag read, Megan. She wiped her hands on her slightly frayed apron and offered a tired but genuine smile. "Welcome to the Crossroads," she said, her voice carrying a gentle Midwestern lilt. "Can I start you off with some coffee? Or are you looking for a menu?" Jack gave a polite nod. "Coffee would be great, black, and a bowl of water for my friend down there, if you don't mind." Megan glanced over the edge of the table, and her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the huge dog. But seeing Kaiser's calm demeanor, she smiled. "He's beautiful. I'll bring a bowl right out." Jack noticed the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a sign of exhaustion he recognized well. "Long shift?" he asked. Megan sighed, tucking a stray piece of hair behind her ear. "A double, actually. My little boy needs braces, and the rent in this county isn't getting any cheaper. You do what you gotta do, you know?" Jack nodded with respect. "You sure do. Thank you, Megan." Megan quickly returned with a steaming mug of coffee and a plastic bowl of water. Kaiser drank politely, not spilling a drop, further testament to his rigorous training. Jack took a sip of the coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground him. For the first time in months, his shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. The low murmur of the diner, the clinking of cutlery, and the heavy warmth of the Ohio afternoon outside the window created a temporary bubble of peace. He watched dust motes dance in the sunbeam slanting through the blinds. It was a good moment, simple and real. But in Jack's life, peace was often just the deep breath before the plunge. The quiet was shattered not by a siren, but by the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine outside. The sound was obnoxious. A mechanical growl that demanded attention, followed by the squeal of tires on gravel. In the booth, Kaiser's ears flattened against his skull, and a low, almost inaudible rumble started in his chest. Jack reached down, placing a reassuring hand on the dog's neck. "Easy," he whispered. The diner door was shoved open with enough force to send the bell clanging violently. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from relaxed to tense. Striding into the diner was a young man who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine ad for arrogance. He wore a crisp white polo shirt with the collar popped, expensive khaki shorts, and designer sunglasses he didn't bother to remove despite being indoors. This was Trent Covington. He was conventionally handsome, with slicked back blonde hair and a jaw softened by a life of ease. He didn't walk, he swaggered, scanning the room with a look of disdain, as if the diner and its patrons were an offense to his presence. He ignored the empty tables and went straight to the counter, tapping his fingers impatiently on the formica surface. "Service!" he yelled, his voice loud and grating. "I don't have all day." Megan, who had been refilling sugar dispensers at a nearby table, flinched at the sound. She hurried over, her face paling slightly. "I'll be right with you, sir," she said, her voice trembling just a little. Trent scoffed, pulling his sunglasses down his nose to peer at her with cold, predatory eyes. "You'll be with me now," he sneered. "I want a table by the window, and I want it clean. This place smells like old grease and failure." The elderly couple near the entrance stopped eating and looked down at their plates, clearly intimidated. In a small-town structure like this, money was power, and Trent Covington wore his family's wealth like a suit of armor. He snapped his fingers at Megan. "Chop chop. My car is worth more than this entire building, and I don't want to wait around while you chat with the locals." Jack watched from the corner, his coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes narrowed, analyzing the threat level. Trent wasn't armed, but he was armed with entitlement, which could be just as destructive in a civilian setting. "Watch him, Kaiser," Jack murmured, barely moving his lips. Kaiser shifted under the table, sensing his handler's spike in adrenaline. The air in the diner grew thick, the humidity suddenly oppressive as the confrontation began to unfold. The atmosphere in the Crossroads diner had soured, curdling from a lazy Sunday afternoon into something brittle and sharp. Trent Covington didn't just sit at the window table. He occupied it, like a conquering general surveying a captured village. His legs were splayed wide and his designer sunglasses were finally pushed up on his head to reveal eyes that held no warmth at all. He tapped a heavy gold ring against the laminate tabletop, a rhythmic click, click, click that set everyone's teeth on edge. Megan, the young waitress whose shift was already 2 hours too long, was balancing a tray holding a pitcher of ice water and a glass, her hand trembling slightly, not from the weight, but from the palpable malice radiating from booth number 4. She approached him cautiously, a forced smile plastered on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "Here's your water, sir," she said softly, setting the glass down on a coaster. As she reached to pour, Trent suddenly jerked his arm, ostensibly to look at his watch, but the movement was wide enough to knock the pitcher in her hand. It wasn't an accident. The smirk that played on his lips gave him away. The pitcher tilted. Ice water cascaded across the table, splashing onto Trent's expensive khaki shorts and pooling on the checkered linoleum floor. The sound of the glass pitcher hitting the table, thankfully not breaking but clattering loudly, was like a gunshot in the silent room. "You clumsy idiot!" Trent roared, leaping to his feet. The chair screeched backward, scraping against the floor liner. He grabbed a napkin and furiously dabbed at his leg, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Do you have any idea what these shorts cost? This is an Italian silk blend, you moron." Megan recoiled, clutching the empty pitcher to her chest as if it could shield her from his verbal assault. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, tears immediately welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean to. You moved your arm and—" "Don't you dare blame me," Trent cut in, his voice rising an octave, cracking with indignation. "This is exactly why people like you end up in places like this. You're incompetent." The diner fell dead silent. At the counter, Mr. Henderson, a retired factory worker with a face weathered by decades of hard labor and a back bent by time, gripped his coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. He looked like he wanted to say something, to defend the girl he'd known since she was a toddler, but his eyes flickered to the window where Trent's sports car sat, a symbol of the financial chokehold the Covington family had on the town. Mr. Henderson bowed his head, shame coloring his cheeks. He, like everyone else in Harmony Creek, knew that crossing a Covington meant losing a loan, facing a sudden eviction, or being buried in legal fees. Fear was the currency here, and Trent was rich. Jack Callahan observed the scene from the back corner, his body motionless, but every muscle coiled tight. He took a slow sip of his black coffee, assessing the situation with the cold precision of a tactical operator. This wasn't a combat zone, but the dynamics of aggression were universal. The bully uses fear to expand his territory. The protector uses force to define a boundary. Under the table, Kaiser made a sound that was felt more than heard. A low-frequency growl deep in his massive chest, a rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The dog's ears were back, his lips twitching just enough to reveal the tip of a white canine. Kaiser wanted in. His instinct was to neutralize the threat to the pack. Jack didn't look down. He simply tapped his index finger twice against his thigh. It was a subtle, invisible signal to the untrained eye. Hold. Wait. Kaiser's growl ceased instantly, replaced by a focused, unblinking stare at Trent's carotid artery. The dog remained a statue of disciplined violence, awaiting the release command Jack hoped he wouldn't have to give. Trent wasn't finished. The humiliation of wet shorts wasn't enough. He needed to perform his dominance. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a thick leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a fat stack of crisp $100 bills. "You've ruined my afternoon," Trent sneered, pulling out 3 of them, "but I suppose you need this more than I do." He didn't hand her the money. Instead, with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the bills into the puddle of ice water on the dirty floor. "Pick it up," he commanded. "That's your tip. Consider it hazard pay for being useless." Megan looked at the money soaking in the water, then at Trent, then around the room. Her face was burning with humiliation. She needed that money. $300 was half her rent. But the price was her dignity. Slowly, painfully, she dropped to her knees, reaching a trembling hand toward the wet floor. Trent laughed, a cruel bark of a sound. "That's right. Know your place." As Megan's fingers touched the wet paper, Trent took a step forward. His foot drew back as if he were about to kick at the puddle or her hand. It was a gesture of pure intimidation, a physical threat meant to make her flinch. That was the line. The invisible boundary Jack Callahan had drawn in his mind had just been crossed. Jack didn't jump up. He rose with a fluid, terrifying grace. One moment he was sitting, the next he was moving across the diner floor, silent and swift. He covered the 20 feet between his booth and the window in 2 seconds. Just as Trent's foot moved, a solid wall of muscle materialized between him and the waitress. Jack stood there, 6'2" of tempered steel, his back to Megan, completely shielding her. He didn't touch Trent. He didn't have to. He simply occupied the space Trent had intended to stand in, forcing the younger man to stumble back to avoid a collision. The air seemed to vanish from the diner, sucked into the vacuum of the confrontation. Megan froze, looking up at the broad back of the stranger in the gray t-shirt. Kaiser had moved with him, a silent shadow now sitting at Jack's heel, no longer growling, just watching with eyes that promised violence. Trent regained his balance, looking up at Jack. For the first time, the arrogance faltered. Up close, Jack didn't look like the local farmers or weary retirees Trent was used to bullying. Jack looked like a cliff face, immovable and dangerous. But Trent's ego was too big to allow him to back down. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Trent spat, trying to regain his posture. "Get out of my way. This has nothing to do with you, old man." Jack didn't blink. His expression was one of boredom, almost disappointment. When he spoke, his voice was low, a deep baritone that needed no volume to carry authority. It was the voice of a man who had given orders in sandstorms and firefights. "It does now," Jack said. "You made a mess." He pointed a single finger at the soggy bills on the floor. "Pick it up." Trent laughed, but it sounded nervous. "You're kidding me. I'm not touching that floor. Do you know who my father is?" "I don't care who your father is," Jack replied, moving an inch closer. That inch felt like a mile. Trent flinched. "I care about manners. You insulted this lady. You threw trash on her floor. Now you're going to pick it up, apologize, and leave." The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Trent looked around for support, but the patrons who had been subdued moments before were now staring with wide eyes, a flicker of hope in their gazes. Mr. Henderson sat up straighter. Trent's face turned purple. He was used to fear, not defiance. He balled his fists, posturing. "Make me," Trent challenged, though his voice wavered. Jack tilted his head slightly. "Son," he said, the word dropping like a heavy stone. "You do not want to find out what happens next. Pick it up." Behind Jack, Kaiser let out a sharp exhalation of breath, his muscles rippling under his fur. Trent looked at the dog, then at the man. He saw no fear, only a calm, absolute certainty of the outcome. It dawned on him. This man wasn't afraid of the Covington name. This man wasn't afraid of anything Trent could do. The fear Trent usually projected onto others was suddenly reflected back at him. Cold and sharp. The silence Trent Covington left in his wake was heavier than the humid air outside. He had backed down from Jack, not with the grace of someone accepting defeat, but with the jerky, erratic movements of a cornered animal. His face was a mask of crimson rage, his hand shaking as he pointed a manicured finger at Jack's chest. "You don't know who I am?" Trent hissed, his voice cracking mid-sentence. "You are going to regret this. I will bury you." Jack didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He just took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, the ceramic mug looking small in his massive hand. The indifference was the final insult. Trent spun on his expensive loafers, kicked the door so hard it swung back against the wall with a sick crack, and stormed out into the glare of the Ohio sun. Outside, the heat was oppressive, but Trent felt a cold chill of fury. He stalked to his silver Porsche 911, gravel crunching under his feet. He didn't get in. Instead, he leaned against the hood, the metal hot on his palms, and fumbled for his phone. His fingers trembled as he dialed 3 digits. He took a deep, steadying breath, transforming his rage into a performance. When the dispatcher answered, Trent's voice changed instantly. It became high-pitched, frantic, the voice of a terrified victim. "911, I need help, now," he screamed into the receiver, pacing the parking lot. "I'm at the Crossroads Diner on County Road 5. There's a man in here, a transient. He's crazy." Trent paused, glancing back at the diner window where he could see Jack's silhouette. "He's assaulting the staff. He has a weapon. I think it's a knife. And he's got this huge, vicious dog. He set it on me. I barely got away. Please, hurry. He's going to kill someone." He listened for a moment, a nasty smile twisting his lips. "Yes, he's very violent. Extremely. Send everyone." He hung up and shoved the phone in his pocket, smoothing down his polo shirt. He checked his reflection in the side mirror, practicing a look of horrified shock. Inside the diner, the tension began to dissolve, replaced by a nervous, jittery energy. Jack set his mug down and finally looked at Megan. The young waitress was still standing by the puddle, her hands twisting in her apron, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "You okay, ma'am?" Jack asked, his voice gentle, stripped of the command tone he'd used with Trent. Megan nodded jerkily, then shook her head.
I think so, but you have to go."
"You have to leave, right now." She rushed to the window, peering out at Trent, who was leaning against his car. "That's Trent Covington. His father practically owns the sheriff's department. They're not going to care what really happened. They'll just take his word for it." Jack stood, not to leave, but to walk over to the spill. He grabbed a stack of napkins from a dispenser and knelt. "I'm not going anywhere, Megan," he said calmly, starting to sop up the water. "I haven't broken any laws. I enjoyed a cup of coffee, and I stopped a man from harassing a woman. Last I checked, that's still legal in Ohio." Mr. Henderson, the retired factory worker, cleared his throat from the counter. He swiveled on his stool, his weathered face etched with worry. "Son," the old man said, his voice raspy. "You seem like a good man, a capable one, but you're not from around here. The Covingtons, they fund the body armor. They buy the patrol cars. When the deputies get here, they're not coming to investigate. They're coming to enforce the Covingtons' will. You and your dog, you're just targets waiting to be shot." Jack finished drying the floor and stood, tossing the wet napkins into a nearby bin. He looked at Mr. Henderson, then down at Kaiser. The German shepherd had his chin resting on his paws, but his eyes were open, watching the door. "I appreciate the warning," Jack said, "but I've spent the last 12 years running toward problems, not away from them. If I leave now, it tells him he was right, that he can treat people like dirt and intimidate anyone who stands up to him." He looked at Megan, his expression softening. "Besides, I haven't finished my coffee, and Kaiser here is still thirsty." He walked back to his booth and sat down. To the onlookers, it was an act of insanity. To Jack, it was a matter of principle. He refused to let a bully dictate his actions. He reached down and scratched Kaiser behind the ears. "Stay alert, buddy," he whispered. Kaiser huffed, sensing the shift in the air. The dog knew the difference between calm and the quiet before the storm. 5 minutes passed. The diner was quiet, but it was a fragile silence. Megan busied herself wiping down the counter, her eyes constantly flicking toward the door. Mr. Henderson didn't touch his coffee. Jack sat with his back to the wall, his breathing steady, his mind running through contingencies. He wasn't naive. He knew small-town politics could be as dangerous as a loaded gun. He checked the time on his watch. Response time for a violent subject with a weapon would be fast. Then the sound came. It started as a distant wail, a rising and falling tone that cut through the humidity like a knife. Sirens, not one, but multiple. The sound grew louder, fast, bouncing off the old brick buildings of the town square. Kaiser immediately sat up, a low growl in his throat. "Quiet," Jack commanded gently. The dog obeyed, but his muscles were taut. Outside the window, the world exploded into color. Blue and red lights flashed frantically, bathing the diner's interior in a chaotic, strobe-like effect. Tires squealed on asphalt as 3 patrol cars skidded into the parking lot, boxing in Trent's Porsche and blocking the exit. Jack watched through the blinds. He saw deputies spill out of the cars. They were moving fast, adrenaline high, hands already hovering near their holsters. This wasn't a social call. This was a tactical response to a violent threat. And standing in the middle of it all was Trent Covington. The transformation was complete. Trent was pointing frantically at the diner, gesticulating wildly, playing the victim to perfection. He shouted something to the lead officer, a thick-set man with a bull neck and a face flushed from the heat. The officer nodded, drew his weapon, and signaled to the others. Trent looked over at the window, locking eyes with Jack. A slow, triumphant grin spread across his face. It was a look of pure malice, a silent promise that the game was over, and he had won. "They're coming in," Mr. Henderson whispered, sliding off his stool to get out of the line of fire. Megan backed up against the kitchen door, a hand covering her mouth. "Please," she whispered. "Don't hurt him." Jack didn't move. He placed his hands flat on the table, palms open and visible. He looked at Kaiser. "Down," he said firmly. "Stay." The dog dropped into a low crouch, his body tense like a compressed spring. Jack took one deep, centering breath. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound immediately drowned out by the screams of men with guns. The peace of the Crossroads Diner was officially over. The heavy wooden door of the Crossroads Diner didn't just open. It was practically kicked off its hinges, slamming against the interior wall with a force that rattled the front windows. The cheerful jingle of the entry bell was immediately swallowed by the heavy thud of boots and the chaotic shouts of men who had arrived expecting a war. Leading the charge was Sergeant Davis, a man whose reputation in Harmony Creek preceded him like a thundercloud. Davis was a physically imposing figure, not from muscle, but from sheer bulk, with a thick neck that spilled over his uniform collar and a face perpetually flushed in angry crimson. He was known throughout the county for 2 things, a hair-trigger temper that exploded at the slightest provocation, and an unshakable loyalty to the highest bidder, which in this county usually meant the Covington family. He stormed into the diner with his service weapon already drawn, a dark glint of steel in the afternoon sun, sweeping the room with a reckless disregard for the innocent bystanders cowering in their booths. Behind him, 2 younger officers, rookie cops with anxious eyes and unsteady hands, fanned out, their fingers hovering dangerously close to their triggers as they mimicked their superior's aggression. "Hands up, everyone. Hands where I can see them, now," Davis bellowed, his voice cracking with adrenaline. He immediately spotted Jack, the only man who wasn't cowering or running. Davis didn't see a decorated commander. He saw the transient Trent had described, a threat to the established order. He leveled his pistol squarely at Jack's chest, the barrel trembling slightly with the intensity of his grip. "On the ground, face down, hands behind your head. Do it now or I will put you down." The diner erupted in panic. Mr. Henderson slid off his stool, knocking over his coffee cup, which shattered on the floor. Megan screamed, ducking down behind the counter, covering her head with her hands. The air was thick with the smell of fear and the metallic tang of impending violence. At the first aggressive shout, Kaiser reacted with the speed of a coiled viper. The German Shepherd launched himself from under the table, placing his 90-pound body directly between Jack and the approaching officers. He didn't charge. He was too disciplined for that. But he held his ground. The hackles along his spine stood up, making him look twice his size. He let out a bark that wasn't a sound so much as a physical force, a deep, concussive report that rattled the silverware on the tables. Kaiser bared his teeth, a wall of white ivory, and lowered his head, his eyes locked on Davis's weapon. To the cops, this wasn't a hero protecting his handler. It was a savage beast preparing to maul them. "Get that dog under control," Davis screamed, shifting his aim from Jack to Kaiser's broad skull. "I said control that animal, or I'm putting a bullet in its brain." Time seemed to slow for Jack. The world narrowed to the black hole of the barrel pointed at his partner. He knew the tactical reality of the room better than anyone. He could see Davis's finger tightening on the trigger, the white of his knuckles showing. He saw the rookies flanking, their fear making them unpredictable. If Jack moved to disarm Davis, the rookies would fire. If Kaiser lunged, Davis would fire. There was no scenario where resistance didn't end with a dead dog and a bloodbath in a family diner. Jack did the hardest thing a warrior can do. He surrendered his pride to save his friend. He raised his hands slowly, palms open and forward, moving with a deliberate slowness to avoid startling the nervous officers. "Do not fire." Jack's voice cut through the chaos, not with volume, but with the authoritative projection of a commissioned officer. "I am an active duty member of the United States Navy. This dog is a rated military officer. If you shoot him, you are firing on a federal agent." The declaration hung in the air for a beat. The two rookie officers hesitated, glancing at each other in confusion. Military dog, rated officer. That wasn't something they covered on patrol. But Davis didn't care. He was in too deep. His ego was fueled by the presence of Trent Covington watching from the window outside. He moved closer, entering the danger zone, his firearm now just feet from Kaiser's bared teeth. "I don't give a damn who you are," Davis spat, sweat beading on his forehead. "I gave you a lawful order. Get that thing on the ground and get your face on the floor, or I swear to God I will kill it right here." Davis's eyes were wild, glazed over with a power trip. He wasn't bluffing. He wanted to shoot. He wanted to prove he was the alpha in the room. Jack looked at Kaiser. The dog was trembling with the need to attack. Kaiser could feel the murderous intent coming off Davis. Every instinct in the animal's DNA was screaming to neutralize the threat before the threat got to Jack. But Jack knew that a single move from Kaiser would trigger a gunshot. He locked eyes with his dog. The bond between them, forged in sandstorms and firefights, had to be stronger than instinct. "Kaiser," Jack said, his voice dropping into a harsh, guttural command. "Down. Stand down." The dog hesitated. It was a moment of agonizing conflict. Kaiser looked back at Jack, a low whine escaping his throat, asking for permission to fight, to protect. "Down, Kaiser." "Now," Jack repeated, putting all his authority into the words. Slowly, painfully, the massive dog lowered his hindquarters, then his front legs. He lay on the dirty floor, muscles still twitching, his amber eyes never leaving Davis's face, burning with a silent promise of violence if the man took one more step. Jack didn't stop there. He knew Davis needed total submission to lower his weapon. With his hands still raised, Jack slowly dropped to his knees. He sank to the linoleum, avoiding the puddle of water and spilled coffee until he was kneeling beside his dog. "We are complying," Jack said, his voice cold and calm, but with a dangerous undercurrent. "The dog is down. I am down. Lower your weapon, Sergeant." Davis smirked, interpreting the surrender not as de-escalation, but as victory. He had brought the big man to his knees. He kept his gun trained on them, savoring the moment. While outside, Trent Covington pumped a fist in the air, laughing as he watched the transient be subdued. Inside, Jack stared at the floor, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with the supreme effort it was taking not to tear Davis apart. He had chosen the path of a prisoner to keep Kaiser alive. But as the cold metal click of handcuffs sounded in the distance, Jack made a promise to himself that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. The click of the handcuffs was a sharp, mechanical finality that severed Jack Callahan's connection to his freedom. Sergeant Davis didn't just apply the cuffs. He weaponized them, wrenching Jack's arms behind his back with an unnecessary force that twisted his shoulder to an angle that would have made a lesser man scream. Jack gritted his teeth, his face pressed against the cold, grimy linoleum of the diner floor, but he remained silent. He knew the game. Any sound of pain would be interpreted as resistance, and resistance would give Davis the excuse he so desperately wanted to use his baton. "Get him up." Davis barked at the rookies, wiping a sheen of sweat from his red, frustrated face. The two younger officers grabbed Jack by the biceps and hauled him to his feet. He stood tall despite the awkward angle of his bound arms, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes immediately searching for Kaiser. What happened next hurt Jack more than any physical blow could have. The rookies approached the German Shepherd with catch poles, treating the highly trained military officer like a feral stray. Kaiser didn't lunge. He didn't bite, but as they looped the cable around his neck and pulled him toward a back door, he let out a sound that tore through Jack's heart, a high-pitched, confused whine. It wasn't the sound of fear for himself, but the anguish of being separated from his handler. Kaiser looked back, his amber eyes wide and pleading, asking Jack why this was happening, why the mission had failed. "It's okay, Kaiser. Easy. I'm right here," Jack shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Shut up." Davis shoved Jack forward, propelling him toward the main entrance. "You don't talk to the dog. You don't talk to anyone." As they dragged Jack out of the Crossroads diner and into the blinding afternoon sun, he heard the heavy metal clang of a K9 cage in a patrol car slamming shut, followed by the muffled, frantic barks of his partner trapped inside. A knot of cold fury tightened in Jack's stomach. They had taken his dignity, but caging his dog was a declaration of war. The scene outside was a circus. The flashing lights of the patrol cars had drawn the attention of the entire town square. Tourists paused their strolls. Shopkeepers stepped out of their doorways and cars slowed to a crawl to gawk. At the center of it all was Trent Covington, leaning against the hood of his silver Porsche with his arms crossed. A look of supreme satisfaction was plastered on his face. As Davis marched Jack past the sports car, Trent stepped forward, invading Jack's personal space. "I told you," Trent sneered, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I told you this was my town. You should have picked up the damn money. Now look at you." Trent laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "Enjoy the jail cell. I hope they put the dog down." Jack stopped. The rookies tried to push him, but he set his feet, becoming an immovable object for a second. He turned his head, locking eyes with Trent. Jack didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look he gave Trent, a promise of ice-cold reckoning, wiped the smile right off the rich kid's face. It was the look of a predator memorizing the scent of his prey. Davis shoved Jack hard from behind. "Keep moving. Don't you stare at the victim." But the narrative Trent was trying to spin was beginning to fray. The diner door opened again and the patrons spilled out. They were no longer silent. Megan was first, tears streaming down her face. But right behind her was a new figure, a man who commanded instant respect despite his frailty. It was Gus Kowalski. Gus was 82, a Vietnam vet who walked with a pronounced limp and leaned on a polished hickory cane. He wore a faded Marine Corps cap adorned with military pins, and his face was a map of deep wrinkles earned through years of hardship. But his voice, when he spoke, was like a foghorn cutting through the humidity. "This is a disgrace." Gus boomed, pointing his cane at Sergeant Davis like a sword. "Shame on you, Davis. I saw the whole thing. That man stood down. He surrendered with honor." The crowd murmured. Phones were raised. Cameras were rolling. Gus limped down the steps, ignoring the police tape. "You're treating a man like a criminal for defending a lady. Since when does the Harmony Creek Sheriff's Department work for the Covingtons?" The accusation hung in the hot air. The other diners joined in. "He didn't do anything." A woman yelled. "That kid started it," Mr. Henderson shouted. Davis's face turned a darker shade of purple. He was losing control of the situation. He needed to reassert dominance, fast. He slammed Jack against the side of the patrol car, the metal searing hot on Jack's cheek. "Spread 'em, now!" Davis yelled, trying to shout down the crowd. He began his search, his hands rough and invasive, looking for weapons, drugs, anything to justify the arrest. He plunged a hand into Jack's back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. "Let's see who you really are," Davis muttered, flipping it open with a sneer, expecting to find a fake ID or nothing at all. Davis froze. His thumb brushed over a hard plastic card. It wasn't a driver's license. It was a common access card, a Department of Defense ID. Underneath it, tucked in a clear plastic sleeve, was a heavy metal coin. It was gold and black, embossed with an eagle, an anchor, a trident, and a pistol. The seal trident, the symbol of the most elite special operations force on the planet. Davis stared at the ID. Chief Petty Officer Jack Callahan, United States Navy. The expiration date was years away. This wasn't some washed-up vet. This was an active duty chief. Davis's throat went dry. His heart skipped a beat, a cold sweat breaking out under his collar. He looked at the trident coin, then up at the back of Jack's head. He realized with a sickening lurch that he had just assaulted, cuffed, and publicly humiliated a senior military officer who could have killed him with his bare hands if he'd chosen to. "What's the problem?" Trent called from near his Porsche, noticing Davis's hesitation. "He's just some bum, right? Probably stole that wallet." Davis snapped his head up. He looked at Trent, who held the keys to his future promotions. He looked at the angry crowd filming him with their smartphones. He looked at Gus Kowalski, who was glaring at him with righteous judgment. Davis was standing on a precipice. If he admitted his mistake now, he'd have to uncuff Jack in front of everyone. He'd have to apologize. He'd look weak, incompetent, and he'd lose the Covingtons' favor. His pride was a thick, choking thing. He couldn't go back. He had to double down. With a trembling hand, Davis snapped the wallet shut, shoving it deep into his own pocket, concealing the evidence of Jack's rank. He took a breath, forcing the lie to form on his lips. "Just what I thought," Davis announced loudly, his voice shaking slightly. "No local ID, vagrancy, disturbing the peace, resisting arrest." He grabbed Jack by the head and shoved him into the back of the patrol car. Get in. Jack didn't fight the push. He'd felt the pause. He knew Davis had seen the ID, and he knew Davis had chosen to ignore it. As the door slammed shut, separating Jack from the shouting crowd and his barking dog, he sat in the suffocating heat of the police cruiser. He wasn't angry anymore. He was focused. Davis had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had turned a misunderstanding into a crime, and Jack Callahan was going to make sure that justice, when it came, was absolute. The interrogation room was a box of concrete and cold air that smelled faintly of bleach and old anxiety. A single fluorescent bulb hummed overhead, flickering with a maddening rhythm that might have broken a lesser man's focus, but Jack Callahan sat on the metal stool with the stillness of a statue. His left hand was cuffed to a steel table bolt, the metal biting into his wrist. Yet his posture was erect, his breathing slow and measured. He wasn't thinking about the charges or the humiliating ride in the back of the cruiser or the ache in his shoulder. His mind was focused entirely on the garage 3 rooms away, where he knew Kaiser was being held. He couldn't hear the dog, and that silence was more torturous than any physical pain. Jack closed his eyes, visualizing the layout of the station he had memorized on the way in. He was calculating exfiltration routes, not for himself, but for his partner. On the other side of a one-way mirror in the bustling squad room, a different kind of tension was building. Sitting at a cluttered corner desk was Officer Riley. She was a fresh-faced rookie 6 months out of the academy with fiery red hair pulled into a tight bun and a spray of freckles that made her look younger than her 23 years. Unlike Davis, who operated on ego and bluster, Riley had joined the force because she believed in the badge. She was now staring at her computer monitor, her brow furrowed in confusion. An email had arrived 10 minutes ago from the owner of the Crossroads Diner containing a file labeled Security Cam Incident. Next to her keyboard, her personal phone was lighting up with notifications. A local Facebook group, Harmony Creek Community Watch, was exploding. A cell phone video taken by a teenager was going viral under the title "Hero Vet Arrested for Stopping Bully." It already had 4,000 shares. Riley clicked play on the security footage. The grainy, black and white video told a story that made her stomach clench. She watched Trent Covington knock over the water pitcher. She saw him toss money on the floor. She saw his aggressive step toward the waitress. And then she saw Jack on screen. The man currently cuffed in interrogation room B didn't look like a transient or a madman. He moved with a precision Riley recognized from her father's time in the military. Jack didn't attack. He shielded. He didn't escalate. He de-escalated. And most damning of all, when the officers stormed in, the footage clearly showed Jack on his knees with his hands in the air, in full surrender, before Davis ever touched him. Riley paused the video, her heart hammering against her ribs. He lied, she whispered to herself. Davis had lied on the report. In the interrogation room, the door swung open. Sergeant Davis entered carrying a clipboard and a smirk that seemed to be chiseled onto his florid face. He slapped the clipboard on the table with a crack. "Time to talk, tough guy," Davis said, leaning back against the wall. "We ran your prints. Nothing in the local system, so you're a ghost. Vagrancy, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, public disturbance. That's an easy 5 to 10. Unless you want to sign this confession and maybe we'll make a deal." Jack didn't look at the clipboard. He looked straight at Davis, his blue eyes cutting through the sergeant's bravado. "I want my phone call," Jack said, his voice flat and hard. Davis laughed. "You're in no position to make demands." "It's my constitutional right," Jack shot back, his voice dropping a decibel, becoming more dangerous. "I want my phone call and I want water for my dog. If anything happens to that animal, Sergeant, a lawsuit will be the least of your problems." Davis's smirk faltered. He remembered the military ID he'd pocketed. He knew he was on thin ice, but he was in too deep to turn back. "Fine," Davis spat. "Make your call, but if no one answers in 2 minutes, we're done." He slammed a desk phone onto the table. Jack picked up the receiver with his free hand. He didn't call a lawyer or a bail bondsman. He dialed a number from memory, a direct line that bypassed secretaries and assistants. It rang once. "Monroe." A gruff voice answered. Jack spoke with clipped clarity. "Colonel, it's Callahan. Code Black situation in Harmony Creek, Ohio. I've been detained by local law enforcement. Kaiser is in custody. Hostile environment." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of a chair scraping back. "Are you injured?" "Negative, but they have Kaiser." "Sit tight, son." The voice on the other end became ice. "I'm 20 minutes out. Don't say another word." The line went dead. Jack hung up the phone and looked at Davis. "We're done talking." Sarah Riley stood up from her desk. She couldn't sit still. She grabbed the tablet with the video evidence and started for the captain's office, but she was stopped by a commotion at the main entrance. The heavy double doors of the precinct didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that commanded immediate attention. The ambient noise of the station, ringing phones, chatting officers, clacking keyboards, instantly ceased. Striding through the door was a man who looked like he was carved from oak and iron. Colonel Samuel Monroe was in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair cut high and tight and a scar that ran down his left cheek that twitched slightly when he was angry. He was wearing his dress blue uniform, his chest heavy with ribbons and medals that caught the overhead lights. But it wasn't the uniform that struck fear into the room. It was his eyes, a cold, focused fury that promised absolute destruction. Flanking him was Chief Brody, the head of the Harmony Creek Sheriff's Department. Brody was a small man with thinning hair and a suit that looked a size too big. He looked exhausted, pale, and terrified. He was practically jogging to keep up with the colonel's long strides. "Colonel, please. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," Brody stammered, wringing his hands. Monroe ignored him. He stopped in the middle of the squad room, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Sergeant Davis, who had just stepped out of the interrogation room. "Where is he?" Monroe's voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. It was the voice of a man who commanded battalions. "Where is Chief Callahan?" Davis froze. The clipboard slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. He looked from the imposing colonel to his terrified chief, and the blood drained from his face. We have a suspect in custody," Davis stammered, his arrogance dissolving like mist. He was resisting. "A suspect?" Monroe took a step forward, invading Davis's personal space. "You have a highly decorated Navy SEAL chief petty officer in handcuffs bolted to a table like a common criminal. You have a military working dog, a lieutenant colonel by rank, locked in a cage." Monroe leaned in, his face inches from Davis's. "You have exactly 30 seconds to open that door or I will have the Department of Defense dismantle this entire precinct brick by brick." Officer Riley watched from the side, clutching her tablet. She saw the fear in Davis's eyes, the panic in the chief's posture, and the undeniable authority of the man in uniform. She looked down at the tablet screen where Jack Callahan was kneeling in the video, protecting the innocent. Justice, she realized, had finally arrived, and it was wearing a Navy uniform. The air in the sheriff's station had become electric. The balance of power had shifted so violently it was almost a physical force. The local bully with a badge was no longer the biggest predator in the room. The order from Chief Brody cracked through the silent squad room like a physical blow. "Get him uncuffed, now." His voice was high and thinned by panic, a stark contrast to the deep, resonant baritone of Colonel Monroe that still seemed to echo off the walls. Sergeant Davis, whose face was now completely drained of color, fumbled for his keys. His hands, usually so steady when asserting dominance over the weak, were shaking so badly he couldn't find the keyhole on the first try. The scraping of metal was the only sound in the room, a testament to his incompetence. When the mechanism finally clicked and the ratchets released, Jack Callahan didn't rub his wrist or glare at his captor. He simply stood, stretching to his full height, rolling his shoulders back with a stoicism that made Davis take a step backward. Jack didn't look at the sergeant. He looked past him, his eyes locking on Colonel Monroe. "Kaiser?" Jack asked, a single word that carried more weight than any accusation. "Secure, Chief," Monroe answered, his voice softening just a fraction for his subordinate. "We're getting him out right now." Monroe turned back to the room, his gaze sweeping over the assembled officers like a searchlight. "You didn't just arrest a tourist," Monroe announced, his voice low, but carrying clearly to the back of the room where Officer Riley stood. "Chief Callahan returned to American soil 72 hours ago. He was leading a task force in the Horn of Africa that rescued 3 American aid workers being held by insurgents. He took a round to his tactical plate and shrapnel to his leg, which is why he has the limp you apparently missed in your thorough assessment." Monroe moved closer to Davis, who was now pressed back against a filing cabinet. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his bravery. He is on mandatory medical leave to decompress from the horrors of war, and instead he comes home to find the very freedoms he fights to protect don't exist in Harmony Creek because a local badge decided to play God. The shame in the room was palpable. The rookie deputies stared at their boots. Chief Brody dabbed at his upper lip with a handkerchief, but the silence was broken by the squeak of the front doors opening. Striding into the precinct was a man used to sucking the oxygen out of a room. Arthur Covington, Trent's father, was a man built of expensive cigars and hostile takeovers. He wore a charcoal Italian suit that cost more than a patrol car, and his silver hair was perfectly coiffed. He didn't walk. He marched, exuding a kind of power that comes from knowing you own the mortgage on half the town. Trailing him was a lawyer, a small man with a briefcase who looked like an anxious shadow. "Chief Brody," Arthur boomed, ignoring everyone else. "I just got a call from my son. He says he's being detained. I want him released immediately and I want the name of the transient who assaulted him. We're pressing charges." He paused, finally taking in the tense tableau at the center of the room, the Navy colonel, the tall stranger rubbing his wrist, and the look of pure terror on the chief's face. "Mr. Covington," Chief Brody said, stepping forward with a new, desperate resolve. "We can't release Trent. He's being processed for filing a false police report and public disturbance." Arthur's face turned the same shade of red as his son's temper. "False report? Are you insane? My son is the victim here. That man," he pointed a manicured finger at Jack, "is a dangerous vagrant. Trent told me everything. He had a weapon. He had a vicious animal." "Your son lied." A female voice cut through the bluster. Officer Riley stepped forward from the back of the room. She held a remote in her hand. "And we have proof." Before Arthur could object, she pressed a button. The large, wall-mounted monitor in the squad room, usually used for briefing updates, flickered to life. The security footage from the Crossroads diner played in high definition. Every eye in the room was glued to the screen. Arthur Covington watched, his mouth open to speak, but closing as the images unfolded. He saw Trent spill the water. He saw the cruel smirk. He saw his son throw cash into the puddle, a gesture of such petty, unprovoked malice that it made the officers wince. Then he saw Jack. He saw the calm intervention. He saw Trent's terrified retreat and the subsequent phone call, where Trent feigned panic while standing safely beside his car. The video concluded with the image of Jack kneeling on the floor, hands in the air, surrendering to save his dog. The screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute. Arthur Covington looked at the screen, then at the chief, and finally at Jack. For the first time in years, the tycoon was speechless. He saw his own arrogance reflected in his son, stripped of any charm or justification. It was ugly. It was undeniable. He looked toward the holding cells where Trent was waiting, expecting a rescue, and Arthur's shoulders slumped. He didn't say a word. He just turned to his lawyer and shook his head, the fight gone out of him. Jack didn't wait for an apology. He didn't care about Arthur Covington's realization or the implosion of Davis's career. "The dog," Jack said to the chief. "Take me to him." "This way, Chief," Officer Riley said, stepping forward. She led the way, walking quickly toward the rear of the station. Jack followed, his limp more pronounced now that the adrenaline was fading. They pushed through heavy fire doors into the garage. The air here smelled of gasoline and tires. In the far corner, inside a wire mesh cage in the back of a patrol unit, was a dark shape. "Kaiser," Jack called, his voice breaking. A sharp bark answered him. Jack didn't wait for Riley to unlock the cage. He reached through the bars of the car window. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here." Riley fumbled with the keys, unlocking the patrol car door and then the cage. The moment the latch clicked, Kaiser exploded out of the cage. He didn't attack. He didn't run. He launched himself at Jack, nearly knocking the chief over. Jack dropped to his knees on the concrete floor, ignoring the pain in his shrapnel-scarred leg. He buried his face in the thick fur of the German shepherd's neck. Kaiser let out a high, thin whine of pure relief, licking Jack's face, his hands, checking for wounds, desperate to reassure himself that his handler was whole. Jack wrapped his arms around the dog's powerful ribcage, squeezing his eyes shut against the emotion the interrogation room had failed to pry out of him. "I'm sorry," Jack whispered into the fur. "I'm so sorry I let them take you." The bond between man and dog, forged in fire and blood, was on full display for everyone in the garage. Colonel Monroe stood in the doorway, watching his best operator quietly break down in the fur of his dog. Even Chief Brody, standing awkwardly behind him, felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't just a reunion. It was the restoration of the order that Davis and Trent had tried to shatter. The soldier had his partner back, and for the first time all day, Jack Callahan finally looked at peace. The fluorescent lights of the sheriff's station now hummed with a different frequency, scrubbed clean of the chaotic tension that had filled the room just an hour before. Justice, often a slow-moving machine in Harmony Creek, was moving with unprecedented speed, lubricated by the imposing presence of Colonel Monroe and the irrefutable evidence replaying on the squad room monitor. Sergeant Davis stood before Chief Brody's desk, his shoulders slumped, looking smaller than ever in his uniform. Slowly, with trembling hands, he unpinned the silver badge from his chest and placed it on the wooden surface next to his service weapon. The metallic click sounded like a judge's gavel. Suspended pending a full internal investigation, Chief Brody said, his voice firm, reclaiming the authority he had nearly lost. You used excessive force, filed a false report, and violated the civil rights of a decorated officer. Go home, Davis, and don't leave town. Davis didn't argue. He didn't look at Jack or the colonel. He simply turned and walked out the back exit. A man stripped of the power he had abused, disappearing into the humid night. In the holding area, the reality of the situation was crashing down on Trent Covington. The door to his cell didn't open. Instead, an officer stood outside reading from a clipboard. Trent Covington, you're being charged with filing a false police report, misuse of emergency services, and public disturbance. Bail hearing is set for tomorrow morning. Trent gripped the bars, his knuckles white. My father is here, he whined, his voice cracking. He'll fix this. But Arthur Covington wasn't fixing anything. He was outside on the steps of the station, surrounded by local news reporters who had arrived as quickly as the patrol cars. The video of his son's cruelty had gone viral, and the Covington name was in a free fall. Arthur stood before the microphones, looking old and defeated. My family, we owe Chief Callahan and this community an apology, Arthur said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. We have failed to uphold the values of this town. We will not be contesting the charges. It was a public humbling, a dismantling of the invincibility that money had bought them for decades. Jack Callahan didn't watch any of this. He was in the parking lot kneeling beside Kaiser, checking the dog's paws and neck one last time for any sign of injury from the catch pole. You're okay, buddy, Jack whispered. You did good. Colonel Monroe stood by the truck, leaning against the fender. I can get you a car back to the base, Jack. Or a hotel. Jack stood, brushing the dust from his jeans. No need, Colonel. We have a long drive ahead, but there's one stop I need to make first. I never finished my coffee. Monroe smiled, a rare expression that crinkled the scar on his cheek. As you wish, Chief. The next morning, the sun rose over Harmony Creek, painting the cornfields in shades of gold and amber. The Crossroads Diner was buzzing. The previous day's incident was the only topic of conversation. Locals gathered over eggs and grits, whispering about the Navy SEAL and the corrupt deputy. When the bell above the door jingled, the conversation didn't just quiet down. It died. Every head turned. Jack Callahan stood in the doorway in a fresh t-shirt and jeans with Kaiser sitting calmly at his heel. For a second, Jack hesitated. He wasn't looking for a fight, and he certainly wasn't looking for fame. He just wanted to pay his bill and leave on his own terms. The silence was broken by the rhythmic tap of a cane. Gus Kowalski, the Vietnam vet, pushed himself up from his usual booth. He didn't say a word. He just started to clap. It was a slow, steady applause. Then Mr. Henderson joined in. Then the couple in the corner. Within seconds, the entire diner was on its feet. The applause wasn't loud or cheering. It was solemn, a solid wall of sound that honored character over celebrity. Jack looked down, uncomfortable with the praise, a faint blush rising on his neck. He gave the room a short, stiff nod, a soldier's acknowledgement, and made his way to the counter. Kaiser trotted beside him, his tail giving a slow wave, enjoying the positive energy. Megan was behind the counter. Her eyes were bright, and though she looked tired, the fear was gone. She wiped her hands on her apron and smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. I didn't think you'd come back, she said softly. I don't like to leave things unfinished, Jack replied, placing a $10 bill on the counter. I believe I owe you for a coffee and a cleanup. Megan pushed the money back. Your money's no good here, Chief. Not today. Not ever. She looked down at Kaiser. And for your partner? Jack smiled, scratching Kaiser behind the ears. He'd appreciate a steak. Rare. No seasoning. Megan laughed. Coming right up. The best one in the house. Jack sat in the same window booth. When the food came, it was a fresh, hot mug of black coffee for him and a perfectly cooked sirloin on a ceramic plate for Kaiser. The diner returned to its normal rhythm, but the atmosphere was changed. The air felt lighter. The shadow the Covington family had cast over the place for years had lifted. Jack watched Kaiser eat politely, the dog pausing only to look up at his handler with grateful eyes. Jack took a sip of his coffee. It tasted better today, richer. He looked out the window at the endless field stretching toward the horizon. He thought of Trent Covington in his cell, of Davis without his badge, and of Arthur Covington's public shame. They had believed power came from what you could take from others, their dignity, their space, their peace. They were wrong. Power, Jack realized, as he watched a tractor kick up dust in a distant field, was the ability to stand still when everything was trying to move you. It was the discipline to be dangerous, but the choice to be kind. It was the quiet confidence that didn't need to shout to be heard. He finished his coffee and stood up. "Let's go, Kaiser. Mission complete." As they walked out, Megan called one last time. "Thank you for showing us we don't have to be afraid." Jack paused at the door, looking back at the young mother. "You were never afraid," he said. "You just needed to be reminded." They climbed into the old Dodge Ram. The engine roared to life, a familiar, comforting rumble. Kaiser hopped into the passenger seat, sticking his nose out the window to catch the country wind. Jack put the truck in gear and pulled out of the gravel lot. They left Harmony Creek behind, a town a little more just than they had found it, the road stretching out before them like a promise. The soldier and his dog drove on, anonymous once more. Just two travelers on a long road, carrying their own quiet peace into the horizon.